Hello, I'm doing a book review, and the book I want to review is The Wake. Now, The Wake is a graphic novel written by Scott Snyder and illustrated by Sean Murray and published by Vertigo Comics. Now, this was first published as a 10-part comic book series, which was published between the years 2013 and 2014, and later on those 10 issues of the comic book series were all put together into one graphic novel. Now, Scott Snyder is also the writer of the comic book series American Vampire, which the first few issues of that series were actually co-written by Stephen King, and he's also the current writer for Batman, like he's written all the New 52 Batman comics. Now, the plot of The Wake is essentially it's two stories in one. The first story is primarily told in the first part of the comic, and the second story is primarily told in the second part of the comic. And the first story is set in present time, and the second story is set 200 years in the future. Now, in the first part of the book, it follows this marine biologist named Dr. Lee Archer, who's contacted by this guy who works for the Department of Homeland Security, and he tells her about this strange noise that they heard at this underwater base at the bottom of the ocean, and she ends up going down there with a few other people to investigate what this noise actually was. And essentially what they find down there is a merman, and basically it turns out there are more of these mermen, and what ends up happening at the end of the first half of the book is these mermen end up pretty much taking over the Earth. Like, they cause, the ocean to flood, and it causes the polar ice caps to melt, and essentially there's a huge flood, and civilization as we know it comes to an end at the end of the first part of the story because of these mermen. And the second part of the book takes place 200 years in the future in this, post-apocalyptic, dystopic world where most of the coastal countries are now underwater, and most of North America is now underwater, and North America is now under the control of what is basically a monarchy. Now, the second part of the graphic novel follows this young woman named Leeward, who you realize has pretty much grown up in this post-apocalyptic world, and in this second part of the story, she's on a quest to find the source of this radio transmission that she heard, and she believes that if she finds the source of this radio transmission, maybe she could possibly set the world back to the way it was before the mermen pretty much destroyed the world. And I don't want to give anything else away about what happens in the story, but let's just say it does get really bizarre, but really cool at the same time. Now, I thought The Wake was a very interesting graphic novel. Now, the first half of this book is really more of a straightforward horror story, and it actually reminded me a lot of a horror film that came out in the 80s called Deep Star 6. It had a very similar plot line to the plot of that movie Deep Star 6, which, by the way, is a really good movie. But as I said, the first half of the story is pretty much a straightforward horror story, but the second half of the story is pretty much this, dystopic action-adventure story, and it's really interesting how different the first part of the story is from the second part, yet at the same time they do connect to each other really well, actually. And in the book, the nature of these creatures is explored, and the book really does explore what the relationship between these mermen and mankind actually is. And the book also gets into a lot of stuff about where we came from and where we're heading as a species. Now, The Wake definitely seems to take some inspiration from other stories. Like, there's definitely a lot of Lovecraftian elements in this story. The book also seems to take a lot of inspiration from a lot of movies like Deep Star 6 and Waterworld, and it even has some Mad Max elements in it as well. Now, even though this book does seem to take a lot of inspiration from other works of literature and even some movies, it's still a pretty original story. Like, I've never really seen a story quite like this. Now, if I were to have a complaint about this book, I would say that in the second half of the story, you realize just how big this world actually is, and there's so much stuff in this book and so many little references to other things in this world that it really does seem like Scott Snyder wanted this to be an ongoing comic book series as opposed to a limited series. And in the story, there's a certain point where the main character of the second part of the book, Leeward, joins forces with these people who are basically pirates, and there's a little section of the book where she goes over all the adventures she ends up going on with these pirates, and a lot of those could be their own story, so you realize that there are all these other stories that could be told, and they're really kind of just glossed over a little bit in the story, and I really feel like there could have been a lot more done with that. Like, I actually think this might be cool if Scott Snyder ended up making this into an ongoing comic book series. But despite that criticism, it's still a really good book, and I would definitely recommend it. So, yeah, if you haven't read The Wake by Scott Snyder, I highly recommend it, and bye.